Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Habitat for Humanity Hong Kong Housing Series. Today's event is the second in a series of conversations about the state of housing in Hong Kong. In each conversation, we're going to be dipping into the lived experiences, expertise, and insights of a speaker both in Hong Kong and then also drawing on the diverse perspective of speakers from overseas. I'm Olivia Wong, and I'm the General Manager of Environmental and Social Responsibility at MTR, and also have the privilege to be the board chair of Habitat for Humanity Hong Kong. I'm really excited to continue the series today with Dr. Mi-Kam Ng from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and also Johann Baar from the Hilti Foundation. Welcome both. Now, Dr. Mi-Kam Ng directs the Urban Studies programs at Chinese University Hong Kong, which promotes implementations of new urban agenda as a means to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. She has also been a consultant of the UN and is recognized by her peers both locally and globally for her work. Johann Baar focuses on affordable housing of the Hilti Foundation, which is a great partner of Habitat for Humanity, I must say, thank you. And he drives large-scale initiatives across the global south, aiming to change how low-income families build and live. A priority is the development of technical solutions for better and safer homes. Both Mi-Kam and Johann have achieved so much, and we can't go through the very lengthy bio. So please do go and check out our social media pages so you can find out more about the accomplishment of both Mi-Kam and Johann. So today, we're going to explore with both of them why and how affordable housing is key to achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Here at Habitat for Humanity Hong Kong, we are part of a global organization, Habitat for Humanity International. We are proud to share that our global organization is a partner with UN Habitat and play a very key role in advocating for the inclusion of adequate and affordable housing as an objective in the SDGs, especially the SDG number 11, which focuses on sustainable cities and communities. We are excited to localize this conversation today by bringing together both our Hong Kong and international experience and perspectives. Now, before we start the conversations, we're going to take a brief look at the current status of SDGs in Asia. So I'm going to pass it to Megumi, which she leads our public policy work for Habitat for Humanity Hong Kong. Over to you, Megumi.
Thank you, Olivia. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megumi. I lead on public policy at Habitat. I'll just bring up a few quick points about the SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by the United Nations as a universal call to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that by 2030, all people enjoy peace and prosperity. However, according to the Asia and Pacific SDG Progress Report from 2022, advancement of the SDGs in the region is slowing down. There's been little or no progress in areas such as sustainable cities and communities, gender equality, and education. And it's estimated that progress in the Asia-Pacific region is running about 35 years behind. With this scenario in mind, we'd like to draw your attention to the key role of housing. Housing as a driver of economic and social inclusion for low-income families and traditionally marginalized groups can positively influence progress on several SDGs. As you can see on this slide, housing is an integral part of 7 of the goals, while directly and indirectly contributing to the progress of several others. And so we're so glad you're here to explore these topics further through this discussion today. That's all from me. Thank you, Olivia. Back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Megumi, for sharing that. So, it's a great way in terms of starting our conversations. So now, as Megumi has shared with us, it is actually quite disheartening to see, based on the research by UN, that Asia Pacific is actually 35 years behind in achieving the UN SDG goals. However, I am very excited, though, to have Mi-Kam and Johann here to share both local and international perspective in addressing the issues of affordable housing. So let's kick off with the first questions and looking at how we can improve the current situations and what can be done in both rural and urban areas to make housing more affordable. I think especially for low-income or traditionally marginalized communities. And also, what are the roles that government and private sectors need to do in terms of making this happen? So why don't we kickstart this with Kim?
Well, I think it really needs to be like a multi-stakeholder effort. In the case of Hong Kong, currently, affordable housing is seen as a kind of like welfare. So perhaps, we need a discussion about whether affordable housing should be sort of like a basic human right. If that is the case, then it will demand the government to rethink about its land distribution policies, making sure that, land resources will be adequate for the building of public housing or affordable housing. And also if people really would like to have their own homes, and therefore the kind of housing to be built need to sort of like, coincide with, say, repayment schedule so that people can afford to pay for their accommodation. There could also be regulations to facilitate housing cooperatives. We do have that among the civil servants before, but that's not continued. So I think we need the government to rethink about the land redistribution, the allocation policies. And for private sector, there could be policies like the many other cities that when property development takes place, there needs to be certain percentage for affordable housing. I think that is also, important. And related to cooperatives, like in other parts of the world, communities, they can pool their resources together. Well, in Hong Kong, maybe it's very difficult to really purchase land, but with the government's facilitation, then they can also rely on community facilities to help build this affordable housing. So there needs to be multi-stakeholder cooperation.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim. And you're absolutely right. I think, just the government or just the private sector actually can't, do everything. And absolutely that, having proper home and, a proper house is a basic human right. So what about Johann? From an international perspective, what are you seeing in terms of the difference between urban and in terms of urban and rural area, which I think is much more distinctive, overseas, not so much in Hong Kong. And also, what are the roles that government and private sector need to do to actually help provide affordable housing?
Thank you, Olivia. The Hilti Foundation is mostly engaged in developing countries or emerging economies to help families in need build better and safer. But I think in many regards, maybe comparable to what we see and what we experience in the more developed world, and that is we need to make markets more inclusive, and that's what we strive for at the Hilti Foundation. How can we help low-income families get better access to what the housing markets offer, and how can we adapt how the market works towards the needs of these families? When I look into the Philippines, for example, we try to help low-income families get access to better materials, get access to qualified services, get access to housing loans or public subsidies. And in the end, we need to change an entire ecosystem or entire industry to make sure those families are included into how these construction markets work. And obviously, with the company in our back at the Hilti Foundation, we have a great source of experience and support for this. I very much agree with Kim that in the end, it is a multi-stakeholder process because you need to work with all these stakeholders involved in these markets. It's the private sector, it's the regulator, the policymaker and decision maker, and obviously it's civil society who need to share what are their needs, who need to raise voice, what is important for them. So, the market can adapt towards their needs.
Great, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I love what you just said, Johann, about in terms of being inclusive and actually talking to the people that really needs the support in terms of what they need and not actually, kind of Wow, I think many of the, many government, many NGOs, we're very passionate in terms of support, but I think we really need to understand from the user's perspective what is needed, and accessibility is key. So, I mean, that is just great. And so, actually our next questions, come from the Hong Kong chapter of UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, the SDSN. And their aim is to mobilize and focus efforts for problem solving for sustainable development. Now, as we touch on, we just talked about the roles of the government, the private sectors, or property developers, especially in Hong Kong. And then, so to what extent do you think it would be possible in terms of human resource, technical skills, policies, legal or financial frameworks, all of these areas, to really introduce a new kind of non-profit making property developer to enter the Hong Kong's housing market, to provide kind of quality housing and transparent constructions and maintenance cost. Mi-Kim, what do you think? Do you think Hong Kong has the appetite?
I'm almost tempted to say that we do have one, the Housing Authority, which is actually building home ownership schemes like subsidized ownership housing. They are building green buildings as well. Most of the new buildings built by our Housing Authority, they are all of green building standards. They're pretty cool in a sense. So in a sense, I think it goes back to my original position, which is like if we see housing as a basic human right, the kind of housing which is like green building with great environment, with clean energy, water, air, sources, and then with sort of like, good public spaces for people to mingle together. I mean, if we really feel like everyone deserves to have that kind of home so that they can live a life of dignity, then maybe we need to really think about how to allocate land, and instead of using land just for exchange, we provide adequate land for people to use so that they can start to build their families, and the communities. And that would require not just sort of like, respect for that kind of housing, but this kind of housing will be perpetually for people's use and not for the market to exchange. And therefore, like in Singapore, their housing development board housing, basically, if you want to sell, you have to sell it back to the government, and then the government do the relocation. So I think that probably is more about the institutional arrangements than setting up yet another organization. In a sense, we do have one, but of course, it's following rules which look at housing still very much as like a welfare.
That's a really good point. So I mean, because as you said, the Housing Authority now have both in terms of like the public housing, but then also for, we can resell, but except that we sell it back into the market versus selling back to the government, and that's actually quite interesting. So then from what you're saying, and just to kind of touch on that as well, is that so then you think that the Housing Authority, based on the current remit, probably won't be able to repurchase a building, so they will be better to actually set up in a different organization.
The current rules are not like that.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yep. Okay. And then would that be something like a government should be doing, or do you think that it should be...
So that goes back to this whole idea. I mean, if you leave everything to the market, I mean, of course, you can do what Johann said, like you have a very sympathetic market, catering for people's needs and offering loans and subsidies so that, even poor people can afford their home. That would be great. I mean, I would embrace that kind of market mechanism as well. But if we don't, we really want like a regular market, and then, then the government needs to do something more, because obviously we do have a segment of our population who will never be able to afford housing in our private, sector.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you. So Johann, what about you from an international perspective? And if you can especially we talked about green building just a little bit earlier before and I think this is one of those areas where I think the conversations become more important. People talk about sustainabilities. And so, and a lot of the green technologies or prop technologies are coming out also from the West. I mean, what are you observing in terms of this? And do you think that there are rooms, for, for non-government, non-profit making property developer?
That's a very hard question, Olivia. Let me start by saying I absolutely agree with Mi-Kim. There are certain segments of of the housing sector where government subsidies are needed or welfare programs, because some families can just not afford to participate in these markets. And that's where the state has an important role. When it gets to how are we providing such housing, I think the most important thing is cost effectiveness, because we need to discuss how can we bring down the cost of construction to be able to build more homes and better homes. And obviously, we all want to provide the best standards to families that need to rely on welfare, to give them a strong basis for further social development, for their inclusion into society, and these kinds of things. And how can you do that without overspending your budget? And as a result, it's cost effectiveness. Using green materials is usually, at least at the beginning, is more expensive than conventional materials because the market is not used to it. I see it as part of our role as a foundation to look exactly into these fields, because at Hilti we always say, as a private philanthropic organization, we are able to take a little more risk in testing and piloting certain also technical solutions that probably others cannot. So again, when we look into the Philippines, for example, where is a big focus of our work, we developed a housing technology that uses bamboo as its sole structural element, that is tested in our labs at Hilti for disaster resilience, that is green, obviously, it sources only local bamboo. And I think we were able to do this because we could take the risk of failing. We didn't fail, that's what I'm happy about, but it does raise a lot of challenges and a lot of questions. In the end, when we think about the very low-cost sector, or also informal construction sector, globally, I believe it's more than 50% of construction that's happening in this field. And then when you think about CO2 emissions and how conventional construction has their share in those emissions, we need to think about the future of building for low-income families, because if we continue to build with those conventional materials and we build bigger and larger also in those segments, we do face big problems. So I do think that the low-cost housing and green technology are very closely connected.
But I think in Hong Kong, our public housing sector should be very proud of itself, because it's all green buildings, so that the operational cost, is lower as well, and that really aligns with this idea of affordable housing. So carbon emission, is embedded in building materials. So I think there's been like a lot of research which try to build. I was in a conference and people are talking about building materials that can actually sequester carbon. I think that will be cool. And then operation, level that's also have carbon emission. That's why we need to cut energy consumption, and then the decommissioning. So the materials, if we use the right materials, which can go back to the sort of like recycling business, and that will be the best option. And I think our public housing is actually doing this life cycle assessment when they do the sort of when they do their construction. I think the problem in Hong Kong is more with the private housing, and maybe the government should be more stringent in terms of like mandating this kind of green building standards. That actually will help us to achieve our zero carbon pledge, by the government.
Great. And I think the construction process and the actual construction is just one side of the coin, because what we also need to do is to look into the life cycle of a house. Is it, how's it insulated? How much energy does do the occupants of the house use over time? What are their chances to use solar or other green energy sources? And like also in low cost contexts in other countries, we try to assess the carbon emissions and the green aspects of the house, not only when we build it, but over a time span of 30 or sometimes even 60 years.
Yeah, totally agree. Because the building we build now will last for so many decades, and that will continuously affect our carbon emissions. So this is super important.
I mean, it's great. I'm loving this conversation, because it also kind of leads to the next question. But, just to kind of, like sort of summarize what we just said, earlier, is that I think that concept of cost effectiveness, it certainly leads to affordable housing. In terms of the sustainability, and then not only in terms of the building material, but in terms of the lifespan of the building becomes really key as part of the affordable housing. And I think, different countries, I think it's both Mikem and Johann have talked about, like Johann from the Philippines using bamboo, which similarly I've seen that, Habitat has worked with bamboo in Nepal as well. It's extremely sustainable, it's fast growing, and, it withstands in terms of even the earthquake. So I think we've seen that happen in Nepal already. And I think in Hong Kong, in terms of the housing authority already looking at green building, ensure the sustainability of it, in terms of the lifespan. And then I guess, you're right, Mikem, is really talking about then how far would the government be looking at mandating certain regulations in terms of even from a private side, in terms of how they should utilize green material. With that kind of leads to then the next question really is, so let's look at, different ways that, now that, we understand that cost effectiveness, green materials, they will provide in terms of affordable housing. And, we can see that from the material side, let's now look at the human side. Let's look at the people, take the people lens. So, we see that when housing becomes more affordable, and then there's generally a ripple effect. More people are able to live under a decent home. And, in terms of the families and individuals, it will actually translate into progress toward SDG. If we can look at is that, what are some of the ways that you think that, by really looking at, building and supporting affordable housings, that we can create a sense of community, a sense of, collective way of supporting each other? Mikem, how about we start with you?
Well, I think if we are talking about decent home, not just 4 walls and a roof, but actually like the kind of green buildings we are talking about, which naturally, we assume that people will have access to clean water, steady energy, air, and then an environment which should be pretty green, So I think that will become like a really safe base for whether kids to go to school to enjoy the education, so that they can always, have a secure home to return to. And then the adults can, do their work, and then they will start to sort of pay attention to the environment. They can actually live a life of dignity. I think that sense of dignity is very important. And once they feel very safe in their home, they will start to venture out. They will start to meet their neighbors. They will start to develop a community and working things together, and trying to sort of like do things together to make their life, even better, doing partnership, SDGs 16, or they will also sort of like support one another, make societies more happy, equitable, and they will develop, through these kind of interactions, they will have a sense of attachment, not just to the place, but to the community. And hopefully, then it will boost their, physical and psychological, socio-emotional, well-being. So I think that will be really like to have this chain effect, to achieve all the SDGs.
Great. I mean, I absolutely agree. I think dignity, I think that's really key part. I think having a proper roof over our head is pure dignity. There's no, nothing fancy. It's not a luxury. It is a basic human right. And, that's a great point. So, Johann, what do you think?
It's actually quite the same thing. When I look at our housing projects, for me, it really starts with security. Having a safe roof over your head, that you don't have to care about sort of the next day and where your family is going to stay, is a huge relief. We work in many places that are disaster prone, and especially there, it is extremely important to have a safe place to live. And then security connects to all the other things that were mentioned already. Dignity is obviously an important issue. The well-being, the psychological effects that a safe place to live has on a family. I think, and that's what I see when I visit the communities that we've supported. It's being more courageous in life. We always say a house is a starting point to take life into your own hands. And that's exactly what a safe place can do. families take the courage to take the next step on their journey of life, and that creates so many ripple effects for how much income a family earns. The health status is positively affected, the education of kids.
Yeah, I think that story reminds me of talking to a family of 5 who just moved into public housing units, and she said when she was in the subdivided units, she dare not, of course she herself dare not, go out, and then she would not allow her kids to go out because all the neighbors were like, all these men and not sure what they were doing. So I totally agree with Johann that it's just so important to have people housed in a secure place that they can call home.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sense of community, that sense of helping and supporting each other, it's so key. Before our conversation today, I remember I shared an article, in terms of looking at a inner city weightlifting in Boston. So then the idea, of that was that really is working with people that has been incarcerated before, that has now come out, they're from a very poor neighborhood. And one of the things is that by using and, having this inner city weightlifting gym is providing that kind of career opportunities for many of the people that are impoverished in terms of, being training them to be personal trainers, and then actually help to create kind of economic programs, so then provide them with upward mobilities. They start to earn proper money in terms of, $20 to $60 an hour to train the clients from a completely different socioeconomic backgrounds. And I think one of the things that, they did a study and did a research, and it's a peer review paper, that kind of says that, people that are able to, by mixing people that are from the lower economic class with a higher economic class, it creates a new network and opportunities. And it also provides those that are in, the clients that are in the upper socioeconomic class, to actually gain a better understanding of the complex social challenges, many of these people have. In some ways, it really kind of helps cultivate relationships, which is crucial for upward mobilities, at least in the US. So I think that kind of brings to that next questions, I kind of wanted to ask is, you both of you talked a lot around community, right? So how do you see in terms of by bringing people of different economic backgrounds or, social backgrounds, to live in proximity, how do you think that it can harness that power of community within what we do, whether it's in Hong Kong or in the global South, in terms of engagement, in terms of, how is it that going to help also in the process of realizing our SDGs? Johann, why don't we start with you first? It sounds like you have a lot of experience, around, globally, with Hilti.
Thanks, Olivia. For me, this question, in a way, connects to the experiences that we have in Europe. I'm from Germany originally. I live in Switzerland. And the European city is pretty much composed around this idea of mixed income societies. So with housing cooperatives, for example, when I look at Zurich, I always try to make sure that in the same street, you have families living with very different incomes, with very different lifestyle, because there is a belief that everyone can learn from each other. You create more of a social awareness among everyone. You create opportunity to create those low-income families occupying land in their little shack. And over time, some of them wealthier, but they stayed in the same neighborhood. You look for very low-income families. In the beginning, it's just a site of maybe 500 houses. They all have this back after 5 years or 10 years has changed. Some families have added a second floor, have added a kitchen garden. And I think that create a new miles of what is possible. It's important.
That's great. Absolutely. I think, in terms of having that ability to kind of build, and we see that quite a bit, in terms of, for example, in Southeast Asia and the Philippines, where they continue to expand, from where they have the original homes and expand and refined and, and so then they can stay in the same neighborhood. But what about in Hong Kong, Mikem? How do you see in terms of the community? Because I suppose we can't really quite build another floor or expand. Well, we can, but then, then how do you see?
Well, I can't help saying that actually human beings are natural placemakers. it's really sad that we cannot do that, because that's how make us humans. If we can, maybe the government should allow people living in public housing estates even, to do a bit of placemaking within their home, because currently it's pretty strict. I mean, that's a side issue. Actually, my colleagues and I did a paper to look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong used to be a very mixed society. Within a neighborhood, you will have, people rich, middle class, or poor people living together, because we are very compact. And so it was easier for people to run into people very different, from themselves. But in our paper, we look at we use the census data, and then we map out for neighborhoods. We used to have quite sizable, like mixed neighborhoods. Then we have like richer neighborhoods and poorer neighborhoods. And what we find out is like for the more mixed neighborhood, either they are moving upscale or they're moving downscale, which is like showing that we are actually more polarized as a society, which is quite sad, I think. Because, like Johann mentioned, if we can have people having very different socioeconomic, status or background, then they can share resources, they can have this informal context, and then they can know one another. And then because they have different levels of resources, so they can come together and figure out ways to resolve problems that will make the whole community more resilient, harmonious. I remember like in Dong Chong, you do have public housing, and then you've got private housing. And the private housing estate, some of the residents, they're very kind. So they organize themselves, pull resources together like books or clothes, so that they can share with those living in public housing estates, or even, thinking about like tutoring their kids, teaching them English. So if we do have these kind of activities to support one another, and people will feel like, especially those who are more marginalized, will feel that they are being supported. And that will sort of like inspire them to work harder to get out, of their current situation. So it's very important. Therefore, I mean, if we can try to make less gated communities, encourage the Hong Kong tradition, the good tradition of having more mixed community, and also having public spaces, open spaces, designing them so that they can be more collegial, that people can come together, run into one another, so that they can have this informal context, and then hopefully that can transpire into sort of like better relationship, long-lasting relationships. Then they can through these relationships to maybe know more about job opportunities, etc. So I think it's so important. It's very important to build mixed communities. Again, like my short stay in Singapore, that's what I noticed in every community, as Johann mentioned, in the case of like Zurich, that they have maybe low-rise detached houses with sort of like middle-income housing with HDB flats. So allowing these people to see one another, they will just see that, okay, we're just in one community. And I think that's very important.
That's great. And I absolutely agree. I think in terms of allowing that sort of public space, allowing people to come together, I think it's really key. And so, this is one of the questions that where it just sort of popped in that we didn't quite prepare, but I'm sure both of you can answer these questions. I think one of the things, we talk a lot around public space, right? And so, so naturally in each of the, like in Hong Kong, we have our challenge in terms of what that public space would actually look like, what would be the opportunity cost. And then I think even, like with Johann, if you look around the world, like, not everywhere that Hilti builds, supports will have also the same kind of luxury. So for example, to build an entire neighborhood. So I'm just curious in terms of from both of your perspective, how do we create these kind of public space when we have limited space or resources? And what it is that we actually, whether it's from a government perspective or for developers' perspective, what is it you think we can actually do to really kind of help create that kind of space to bring people together? What are some of the things we can do?
Well, I think Hong Kong always has this shortage of space. We've been experimenting with it. So I think it depends on how we look at public spaces. They don't need to be always parks. In Hong Kong, I think even our streets and our markets, they are natural public spaces. And we've been using them quite well, especially in the old urban areas. It's only like sometimes in the new towns, we slot everything into the shopping malls. And shopping malls may not make as great as, public space as our traditional markets or streets. Sort of like force us to really rethink about the way we design streets or markets. And also, I think my architect friends, he always had this very interesting analogy. Is that we can build these public spaces by observation. You observe these old ladies, old men. They always pull their chairs under a tree, very close to toilets, etc. And then they will have a very good time together. So if we do observation, involve the people, allow them to come into the process and tell us what do they think, is a good public space. So I think that will help as well. So this collective wisdom from the people will actually help us to turn every single leftover space into, more interesting one. And of course, when we do planning and design, even within very tight land constraint, if we think that is so important, it's like people's social living room, then that needs to be think first rather than last. Think about where should we put this important public space before we think about the design of the buildings, then it will be successful.
That's a great point. Johann?
I think the idea of observation is so important. I totally agree. The market is a great example because I feel we need to find ways to make public space owned by the people. How do you create ownership? You have to make it relevant to them. And a market is a typical example of why it is relevant. There are many what I would call artificial spaces today that look great, where architects have put a lot of thought and money into. But in the end, it remains artificial. And that's what we sort of need to change. And often you see examples where basically the people who live there use it in a very different manner than it was originally planned. And that's a great thing because that creates ownership. I very much agree. Observing is the first and most important aspect to it. And when I think about complete neighborhoods that are being established, we always speak of what we call the three circles. It starts with a family, and we need to understand their needs and aspirations. And then the second is the physical house that surrounds them, and security was mentioned as one important aspect for it. But then there is the third circle, and that's the infrastructure that surrounds them and the entire community. I think that has an equally important role in creating opportunities for families and for society. And it's important that we focus on this. And that's something that we often miss when we speak about social housing or low-cost housing, and that is aesthetic. The beauty of a building helps families feel dignified in a sense. And while I mentioned cost effectiveness in the first place, sometimes we need to get over cost effectiveness and also look at the aesthetics of a place or an environment, because I think it contributes a lot to well-being and also to social development.
I love this because, I absolutely agree. I think in terms of, having that collective wisdom, really, again, going back to is asking the user, what is really important to them, right? And, having that sort of observations and, and building a community, I think is something that I recall when I went to Haiti to build. That year on the Jimmy Carter bill. And one of the things that I noticed is that when they created a neighborhood, they make sure that there were little shops where the people actually can serve the community. And then they provided a space where people come together, with gardens and everything. So again, of course, they have the luxuries of land, but then ultimately it was something that they didn't have before. It wasn't a community that was created. But then when they start thinking about it, and I think as both Mikem and Johann, you talked about, is to think about when you're building, it's not the house itself, but if maybe first think about the community that we are trying to build, the community that we're trying to create, and build from there, and then see how the house or the home actually fits into that community. So I mean that's wonderful. So I know that we're starting to run out of time, and I know that I trust that there are questions that may be out there from the audience. I do have one last question, but I'm not going to ask that yet. That will be the last questions that I have. But then I think we're going to first start with this to see in terms of whether any of our audience have any questions. So then for, anybody, like if you wish, to ask questions, you can either unmute yourself or you can post it into the chat box. And then, we will ask questions to our, to our speakers. We got Taylor. Taylor, please.
Olivia, thank you so much, and I really appreciate the really enjoyable discussion that we've had today, particularly on the point of making or taking ownership of public space. I think that's something that would be great to see even more examples of that in Hong Kong. So I think the question that we've been circling around would love to get the panel's thoughts on, or just, the SDGs has a component of partnerships in it, and wanting to be able to, do that globally and locally, but also obviously within markets within Hong Kong itself. So, where the folks here have seen partnerships really work well for affordable housing, quality housing in Hong Kong, are there any particular areas where you think there's real potential, but just needs more focus on the partnership aspect in Hong Kong?
Who would like to take that one first?
Well, it's about Hong Kong, so
yes. So
maybe Johann,
we can have international perspective
outside,
too.
Yes, outsider perspective. That would be great.
Speaking about partnerships, I think what we raised in the beginning was extremely important. It's always a multi-stakeholder effort to make housing work. When we think about ecosystems, we usually think of three main stakeholder groups. That's government, that's civil society, and that's private sector. And all of these three need to work together. And usually one contributes a little weaker, the other contributes a little stronger. And in every environment, it's different who's the stronger or the weaker part. And I think what we need to do in driving such multi-stakeholder processes is really understand where are the gaps. Where do we need to add additional stakeholders? Where do we need to, make things work because one of these sectors has not been engaged on a sufficient level or hasn't identified yet the solutions that we need. And then there we need to focus and set a priority. I'm here at a conference right now in Austria where we discussed the future of philanthropy. And we basically discussed exactly the same thing. How can we create such partnerships for impact at a large scale for the future? And we basically said, when we look at foundations, but also at implementing organizations, it's usually a coalition of the willing, those who have their sort of their own idea of how to drive things, but it's not always the organizations or the stakeholders that are needed the most. And what we need to do is find unlikely allies, those who are not yet sufficiently engaged, but that are needed to create this change that we all look for. And it does contain advocacy, for example. It does contain awareness raising. We need to actively make sure we get all the right partners on board to make change happen. And I think that's something where we still can improve. Maybe also in Hong Kong, that's something that you have to comment, Mika.
Well, I think, yes, definitely. I think what you've said should apply to Hong Kong as well. And if we really are pushing for housing as a basic human right, decent housing, so that people can have dignity, then maybe the government needs to really play a stronger role, being not just a facilitator, but maybe also increase its role as a regulator, and also maybe introducing some rules, as I've mentioned, encouraging the private sector to go beyond its rather comfortable profit-oriented stance to really look also into a sector which maybe with a bit of help, they can also afford housing in the markets and not relying solely on private sector provision. So that everyone will sort of like go beyond its comfort zone a little bit so that we can actually aim at providing housing for Hong Kongers, so that everyone will have a happy home, so that we can have a happy city in a sense. And even for communities, I understand that maybe, if families have a few flats, that maybe they might want to do a bit of philanthropy work, give it to Be Bright, and then renting it out to needed families. Or if you don't have that luxury, but you still have extra resources, then maybe go and help them, love them, care for them, so that they feel like there are people who care for them. So that people who live in subdivided, housing now, because of that support, they will have that energy and that faith, to move on. So I think all of us can do something. I mean, like Habitat International, right? You guys have been doing all this great volunteer work. More people should join you guys.
Thank you for that pitch. Yes, absolutely. I think partnership comes in all forms. And so, there are different ways in terms of supporting. It's not only just turning to the governments or to the private sectors, but there's all forms of partnerships and all kinds of things that we can do. We have another question that's kind of raised from the Canadian International School chapter, the HFX chapter. So please unmute yourself and ask away.
Yeah, so we were wondering, as students at our school, what could we do to contribute or to bring change?
Ekem, you're in the education side. What would you be telling the young people?
First of all, John Olivia's organized. I mean, not MTR. I mean,
MTR too. We do a lot of philanthropy.
Do you do affordable housing? Okay, our program actually is a partner of the World Urban Campaign. So we make SDGs compulsory for almost like every single course. We included that, teaching our students the importance, not just the importance of SDGs, but actually their interconnectedness. So we need to see that 17 SDGs, as interrelated. It's not like separate things. So they are related to the building of planet, people, place and people friendly cities, neighborhoods. So I mean, in terms of knowledge and understanding, we do need to know, therefore, understand so that we can actually, our heart will be moved and then we'll do things, to make changes. So I think that is important. I think all of us can mainstream SDGs, develop this sustainability thinking in everything that you do. I mean, we require our students to really show their sustainability thinking in every assignment that they've done. So I think that is important. And as an academic, personally, I think we think that it would be important to really translate, to develop a set of indicators that can help us to evaluate the achievement of SDGs at the neighborhood level, that will help to communicate a better, message about the things that we need to do in terms of providing, affordable housing. Talk to your parents if they have spare resources and see how they can contribute. But for you guys, perhaps you learn first, and then once you have a better understanding, understand the current situation, then you can actually come together and think of ways that you can contribute. For the time being, join some volunteer work to try to learn how to resolve problems. I understand that not a lot, but I know some sort of international school kids, they've been organizing themselves, helping some of those kids living in subdivided units with their English, and also, again, sharing resources. So I think that sharing of resources perhaps is the least we can do as a starting point. I mean, think about this. All those who have will share a little bit of what they have with those who have not. That will make a lot of differences as well, already. I think.
That's so great. Johann, anything else to add on top of what Mika just said?
It's basically all being said. I think what is important to understand is that engagement is possible on all levels, and there is no better or worse. Everything that we can do helps. So even if it's on a private or family level, that friends live under difficult circumstances, try to find out what you can do to help them and do it. And then volunteering is a great way to sort of take it to a more organized or more institutional form, this kind of engagement. And there are great organizations like Habitat for Humanity that offer opportunities for volunteering. It's a great way to help and at the same time get educated about what are the SDGs about, what is social development, what are the complexities for low-income families to develop. That's a great way to engage too. At Hilti, we started a program that we call Engage Beyond Business. And that's for our members of staff and our teams to really engage for a couple of days per year to do good and to help create impact for low-income families. There are so many ideas among our team members what we can do to help. And, it starts with collecting waste, but it goes all the way to building homes for low-income families. We have programs where we help NGOs build organizational change. So it's a lot of things. And you can start on an individual level, but then it always helps to look into making it more of an organizational form or institutionalized form to grow and create more impact over time.
Well, I think that kind of inspires me to think about if our transitional housing sites, would allow this kind of chipping in of business resources or brilliant students like the Canadian school students, they probably ask your last question, Olivia, it seems. But anyway, well, and I want to say, I think the miracle of doing this kind of, it seems like you're helping others, but you also benefit because according to our research, if you do this kind of work, you are actualizing yourself. You feel like you are contributing. That will contribute to your psychological and social well-being. I mean, isn't it wonderful? So you think you are helping others, but you actually, in the end, also benefit yourself. So I think that is a great kind of work that Johann and his colleagues are doing.
Yeah, you're right, Mika. The Canadian international school students are you guys are just so smart. You already asked my last question I was going to ask. But I think just to kind of say, at the end, I totally agree with both of the speakers. I think it's gaining that understanding. You got to understand what the problem is. And sometimes it's not so obvious. It's not like you look at it and you think that's the problem. Ask the design thinking concept, ask 10 whys, before you really get to that issues. So you have a really good understanding. I think, also both of the speakers talked about in terms of impact and tracking. How do you know you're making progress? How do you know that you're making a difference? You got to go and track. You got to measure. And so, it's all about impact measurements. And, we do that in an organization. You do that, when you're doing business. You do that as well when you're talking about social projects. I think having that kind of engagement, volunteering, being physically there, being, being within the community and understanding what the challenges are, that really makes a difference. It's great to read about it, but then it's far cry from when you are physically there and actually being amongst and in that community to understand what the challenges are. And again, going back and ask the users, what are the issues? What are the challenges they have? And just of course to pitch, for what Habitat is doing. We have project schoolwork, we have project homework in Hong Kong, and hopefully in a later stage when we are able to open up, with the Global Village Bill, people can actually go out and start building as well. And again, doing these kind of volunteer work is really important. And I love what Mikem said, at the end it is talking about when we are helping others, we think we're helping other people, we are actually really building that kind of psychological resilience within ourselves as well, and really kind of understanding that at the end of the day that sometimes, we may, kind of get into a place where we feel, things are not going well, you're feeling down. But at the end of the day, when you're really kind of seeing what are some of the challenges that other people are facing, you start to kind of realize that, hey, wait a minute, I actually realized that, I'm pretty good. I'm able to now use, maybe channel that energy into supporting other people as well. So, I know it's great. And I think we're coming up to the end of the hour. And so, I do want to kind of, just say that, I want to thank both Mikem and Johann, for taking the time out and, talking to us today, sharing your experience, your expertise, but especially in terms of your passion of supporting those that are really in need. I think that's just really important. And I think we're supposed to be sharing a link in the link bar in our chat box, that kind of, you can find out more about the work for both Mikem and Johann in terms of Hilti, what they're doing. Up there we are, right there. It's in the chat box now if you want to find out more. We would love to have all of you to come and join us for the next event in our series. It's going to be on the 3rd of October, which is, by the way, World Habitat Day. And so, at that series, our guests are going to explore World Habitat Day theme, which is about mind the gap, leave no one and no place behind. So we're looking at the problem of the growing inequalities and the challenges in the cities and in Hong Kong, and what it is that we can actually do about it. So I really look forward for everyone to join us the next time. Do tell your friends and your, friends, your colleagues, your family about it so that they can join us next time as well. And then, we hope that, that you will, take some time to learn if you don't know what Habitat, what Habitat for International or Habitat for Humanity Hong Kong, what we do. Please go and check us out. We're always looking for people to come and, to volunteer with us, to support us. And then even if you just kind of want to learn more about us, do come and look us up, and we're really happy to share. So once again, I want to thank you, Mikem and Johann. I think Johann is really early for you. I'm going to guess. So thank you to both of you for joining us today. And thank you for everybody that's joined us on this series, the conversation today. And we look forward to see all of you again next time. Thank you so much.